I was raised in a devout Catholic family in Germany. My parents instilled in me a deep faith and a love for the church. As a child, I attended Mass regularly and prayed often. However, in my teenage years, something changed. I began to experience strange sensations and episodes of seizures. I would hear voices and see visions that I couldn't explain. I felt like I was losing control of my mind and body. My parents took me to see doctors, but they couldn't find anything physically wrong with me. Eventually, we turned to the church for answers. We believed that I was possessed by demons and needed an exorcism to be cured. We spoke to our local priest, who referred us to 2 other priests with experience in exorcisms. I was both frightened and relieved when I learned that an exorcism was our next step. Frightened because I didn't know what to expect, but relieved that maybe this would finally put an end to my suffering. Little did I know that what was to come would be even worse than what I had already endured. The day of my first exorcism session arrived. I was scared, but I also felt a glimmer of hope that maybe this would finally end my suffering. The 2 priests arrived, and my family and I welcomed them into our home. The exorcism sessions were unlike anything I had ever experienced. The priest prayed over me, sprinkled holy water on me, and spoke to the demons they believed were inside me. The demons would respond through me, and I felt like I was no longer in control of my own body. The sessions were physically and emotionally exhausting. I would convulse, scream, and speak in different voices. I felt like I was being torn apart from the inside. After each session, I was left feeling drained and traumatized. My physical condition deteriorated with each passing day. I stopped eating and drinking properly and lost a lot of weight. My body was covered in bruises and wounds from the violent seizures I was having during these sessions. Despite all of this, my family and the priest believed that the exorcisms were working. They thought that the demons inside me were being weakened and that I would eventually be cured. But as the days turned into weeks, I only got worse. I began to realize that the exorcisms were not working. In fact, they were making things worse. But I was trapped in a cycle of desperation and hopelessness. I didn't know how to escape, and I was terrified of what would happen if we stopped the exorcisms. The exorcisms had taken their toll on me. My body was weak, and my mind was shattered. I first heard about the Dyatlov Pass incident when I was studying Soviet history in college. The story immediately fascinated me, and I became obsessed with uncovering the truth behind the tragedy. The incident took place in 1959 in the remote Ural Mountains of Russia. A group of 9 experienced hikers set out on a trek to reach the peak of a Torten mountain. The group was led by Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old student at the Ural Polytechnic Institute, and consisted of 8 other students. The location of the hike was remote and challenging, with freezing temperatures, strong winds, and treacherous terrain. The group was well prepared, with specialized gear and extensive experience in hiking and camping in harsh conditions. The Soviet Union during the 1950s was a time of significant change and upheaval. Stalin had died just a few years earlier, and the country was going through a period of de-Stalinization. The atmosphere was tense, and people were hesitant to speak out against the government. Against this backdrop, the Dyatlov Pass incident occurred, sending shockwaves throughout the country and beyond. The incident remains one of the most enduring mysteries of the 20th century, with many theories and controversies surrounding the case. As I delved deeper into the story, I became increasingly curious about the events leading up to the incident. What drove these hikers to undertake such a perilous journey, and what ultimately led to their untimely deaths? With these questions in mind, I set out to uncover the truth about the Dyatlov Pass incident. The day of the hike had finally arrived, and I was filled with excitement and a sense of adventure. The Ural Mountains were a mysterious and alluring place, and I was eager to experience them firsthand. As we set out from the town of Vizay on January 23, 1959, the air was bitterly cold and the sky was a deep shade of blue. The crisp snow crunched beneath our feet as we began our ascent, following the path that the hikers had taken years before. Despite the beauty of the landscape, there was an underlying sense of unease that lingered in the air. The group was tight-knit, but there was an unspoken tension between us that grew stronger as we journeyed deeper into the mountains. As we trudged through the dense forests and up steep mountain slopes, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The silence of the wilderness was deafening, broken only by the sound of our footsteps and the occasional call of a distant bird. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the snow-covered terrain. We made camp for the night, setting up our tents and building a fire to keep warm. The flickering flames cast eerie shadows across the snow, and the wind howled mournfully through the trees. As we settled in for the night, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread creeping over me. The knowledge of the hiker's fate weighed heavily on my mind, and I couldn't help but wonder what dangers lurked in the darkness. The night was long and restless, with the wind rattling our flimsy tents and the snow falling steadily outside. I lay awake, listening to the sound of my own breathing and the distant howl of wolves. The silence of the night was suffocating, broken only by the sound of my own racing heartbeat. As we set out the next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest felt denser, the air colder, and the silence more oppressive. The mood of the group had shifted. The once joyous atmosphere had been replaced with a sense of unease and tension. The journey was taking a toll on the hikers, and the weather was worsening. On February 1st, 1959, the group made camp on the slopes of Kolachiako, a mountain in the northern Ural Range. That night, something happened that would change the course of the expedition forever. I could feel the tension in the air as we approached the site of the incident. The area was desolate and isolated, with no signs of life for miles around. The hiker's tent had been slashed open from the inside, with no sign of struggle or disturbance in the surrounding area. The group's belongings, including shoes and warm clothing, were left behind in the tent. As we followed the trail of footprints in the snow, it became apparent that something had gone terribly wrong. The hikers' tracks led downhill towards a nearby forest, and some of them were barefoot and only wearing thin clothing. As we entered the forest, the scene became even more bizarre. The hikers' bodies were scattered throughout the area, some of them in a state of undress and with severe injuries. The cause of death was not immediately apparent. Some of the hikers had died from hypothermia, while others had suffered from internal injuries that could not be explained by the elements or physical trauma. The scene was gruesome and disturbing, and I could feel the weight of history bearing down on me. The Dyatlov Pass incident had gone down in history as one of the most mysterious and unexplainable tragedies of the 20th century. As I looked around at the desolate landscape and the broken bodies of the hikers, I couldn't help but wonder what had caused their untimely demise. It was the winter of 1970, and my family and I were moving to the country, leaving behind the hustle and bustle of city life. We had dreamed of a simpler life, surrounded by nature and fresh air. As we drove up to the house, I couldn't help but feel a bit intimidated by its size. It was an old farmhouse, with a big porch and a large yard. My parents had always wanted a big house, but this one seemed almost too big for our family of 7. Nevertheless, we were eager to explore our new home. We quickly unloaded the moving truck and began to unpack. As we started to settle in, strange things began to happen. Doors would slam shut on their own, and cold spots would appear in certain rooms. We would hear strange noises throughout the house, and our dog would bark at nothing in particular. At first, we brushed it off as just the creaks and groans of an old house settling, but the occurrences became more frequent and intense. I would wake up in the middle of the night feeling like I was being watched. Sometimes I would see a woman in a gray dress standing in the corner of my room, but when I would turn on the lights, she would disappear. My siblings and I would often talk about the strange happenings in the house, but my parents were dismissive. They didn't want to believe that something paranormal was happening in our new home. As the days went by, the strange occurrences in the house became more frequent and intense. We started to feel like we were living in a horror movie. The once calm house was now filled with an unexplainable energy, and we could sense something was lurking in the shadows. It started with the small things like doors closing on their own, but it quickly escalated to something far more sinister. The temperature in certain parts of the house would drop suddenly, and we would feel an icy chill run down our spines. Toys that we had left in one room would inexplicably appear in another room. We would hear footsteps when nobody was around, and whispering voices that seemed to come from nowhere. But what was most alarming was the apparitions that we began to see. My siblings and I would see a woman in a gray dress, watching us from the corner of our eyes. She seemed to be stuck in a loop, doing the same actions over and over again. We would see her walking through the walls, disappearing into thin air, and then reappearing again. It was like she was trapped in some kind of time loop. Then there was the malevolent presence that we all felt. We couldn't see it, but we could sense it was there. It felt like it was watching us all the time, like it was studying us. It was a feeling of pure terror that we couldn't shake off no matter what we did. As time went on, the haunting became increasingly intense. Our family pets would refuse to go near certain areas of the house, and we started to feel like we were being suffocated by an invisible force. It was like the house was alive, and it was slowly taking control of us. The Perron family was under attack, and we had no idea what we were dealing with. The haunting had become unbearable. My family and I were living in constant fear, and we knew we had to seek help before things got any worse. We decided to reach out to the experts in the paranormal field to help us understand what we were dealing with. We contacted Ed and Lorraine Warren, two of the most renowned paranormal investigators of their time. They agreed to visit our home and conduct an investigation. As soon as they arrived, they could feel the negative energy in the house. They conducted a series of tests and found that there were multiple spirits in the house, including one that was particularly malevolent. They explained that those spirits were likely tied to the land and that the previous owners of the house had experienced similar activity. The Warrens advised us to perform a seance to try and communicate with the spirits. We were hesitant, but we knew we had to do something to put an end to the haunting. We gathered around the table and began to call out to the spirits. Almost immediately, we could feel a presence in the room. The temperature dropped suddenly, and we could see our breath in the cold air. The table began to shake violently, and we could hear whispering voices all around us. It was like the spirits were trying to communicate with us. Suddenly, the room fell silent. The energy in the room had shifted, and we can feel a sense of peace wash over us. It was like the spirits had finally found peace and had moved on.